Postcards from Santiago from the archives. All my talks come to fruition by my reading a book. Obviously some books are easier to read than others, so when I first open a book I don't know what awaits me, but I hope this one will produce a fairy story. Long before Erlen, Haaland, Thierry Henry and Eric Cantona, there was George Robledo, the first overseas star of English football. Abandoned by his father as a child in Chile, Robledo came to the UK, where he was raised in the Yorkshire mining village, serving underground as a begging boy during the Second World War prior to making his name with Barnsley. During the 51-52 season, his 33 goals for Newcastle in what is now the Premier League were the most goals scored in a single season by an overseas registered foreign-born player, a record that has stood unbroken for over 70 years, despite what the record books say. This book is the poignant, inspiring story of Robledo's remarkable journey from the moonlight waste of the Atacama Desert to the cover of John Lennon's 1974 album Walls and Bridges, via Wembley Glory and the 1950 World Cup in Brazil, where in England's first ever World Cup match, Robledo became the first Football League player from outside the British Isles to face England in an official international. Tomorrow never knows. She weighed 18,000 tons, measured 550 feet in length and spent her working life between her home port of Liverpool and Valparaiso in Chile. She was the Queen of the Pacific, launched in Belfast in 1931, regarded as something of a jinx by those who served aboard her. She ran aground on a sandbank off Bermuda with 400 passengers on board. There was an explosion in the engine room in the Irish Sea, killing 28 crew. But most famous of all, former UK Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald died on board in the Atlantic Ocean on the way to South America for a holiday. The Queen of the Pacific and her dark reputation soon put the kibosh on that. A newsworthy drama befell Elsie Robledo and her three sons one March morning in 1932. Born in the terraced house that was 3 York Street, West Melton, Yorkshire, on October 27, 1895, Elsie Oliver took a job in Argentina as personal assistant to the wife of George Ellis, a chemical engineer, in 1924. Mr. and Mrs. Ellis relocated to Oficina Alianza in Chile. Elsie went with them. She met Aristides Robledo, the company accountant at the mine where she worked. They married, settled down and had 3 children. George, born 1926, Edward or Ted, 1928, and Walter, 1931, by which time Mr. and Mrs. Ellis were returning to the UK. A military coup tipped Chile into political instability, so George Ellis booked passage on the Queen for all 5 Robledos. Voyage to England. Ready to depart, at which point Aristides said he was going to buy cigarettes. He never returned. Everybody searched the ship. In the end, they couldn't delay any longer, so they pulled up their gangway and left without him. Why did Aristides do it? That in the Robledo family was the $1 million question. Maybe his marriage was disintegrating. Perhaps, as his younger son Walter always Aristides was having an affair and abandoned ship to be with his secret love. Finally, on Saturday, April 2nd, 1932, Liverpool loomed out of the haze. The Robledo family went through customs before embarking on the final leg of their mammoth journey, this time by train through the Pennine Hills to Elsie's native Yorkshire. Soon after arriving, the Robledos moved into 97 Barnsley Road, West Melton, living above a corner shop run by an uncle. The shop was called Oliver's. Elsie turned it into a general store, providing all and sundry. George started attending Brampton Ellis Infant School. It helped that his first language was English, courtesy of his mother. The people of West Melton were the poorest in the UK. Barnsley, 5 miles away, suffered the highest mortality rate in Britain. The mines kept the economy going. The fathers worked in the pits. Some fathers would gamble too much or drink too much, and the children would suffer. MV Reynardale Pacifico, the ship on which the Robledo family sailed to the UK, is seen in the near photo. The all-conquering 1938-1939 Brampton Ellis Senior School team far photo with George sitting proudly on the front row, seated centre. Early days. Ashley Ball of the Barnsley Chronicle said, "The one thing they celebrate in the Dearne Valley is when their local heroes go on to do great things. The Robledo brothers were heroes. We get our joy from the playing fields of England. Our world was football. Those austere streets were our football field. A football wasn't even needed. A tennis ball would do. 4 courts for goalposts at virtually no cost. We had a game that occupied and stimulated every boy in the village, week in and week out." George was also remembered as being above everyone else in the school team, not in stature, but in skill. Of course, Ted also made a living from football, but it was always more of a journeyman play, whereas George was the genuine article. Headmaster of the school, Harold Steer, said young Walter would have been the best footballer out of the 3 of them had he not worn spectacles. On leaving Brampton Ellis Senior School, aged 14 in 1940, fresh from scoring 5 goals in the final of that year's Totty Cup, a 2-2 draw against Bolton Modern, followed by a 4-0 win in the replay, George started attending Barnsley Mining and Technical College with a view to getting a trade under his belt. Football, tennis and college, keeping an eye on his mum and 2 younger brothers. That was George Robledo in his mid-teens. As war raged around the globe, he was young, he was confident, he was strong. At which point the war itself, or to be more precise, Ernest Bevan, intervened. Working class hero. On Tuesday, October 12, 1943, Lloyd George, Minister of Fuel and Power in Britain's coalition government, announced in the House of Commons that some conscripts, instead of going to fight, would in future be directed to the mines. By the autumn of 1943, supplies of coal to fuel the war effort and heat domestic homes during the impending winter were running horribly low. The UK depended on coal to power its ships and trains. 3 months later, on December 2nd, Ernest Bevan, Minister of Labour and National Service, came to Parliament to put some flesh on the bones of the policy Over the next 5 months, 30,000 men aged from 18 to 25 to what became known as the Underground Front. If your registration number came out, then you were a bevy boy, destined for a mine. If you didn't go, prison beckoned. On April 14, 1944, George Robledo turned 18 years old and he was posted to Wath Main Colliery and so began 13 months juggling professional football and mining. It started with 6 weeks training, 4 spent in a classroom in Doncaster, then 2 at Wath Main itself. George wore his helmet and his steel-capped safety boots. Coal mining was regarded as the most dangerous job in the UK. Thousands of men were killed or seriously injured, with many more contracting industrial diseases. Sanctuary at Oakwell. George found sanctuary at Oakwell, Barnsley's home ground, where 5-figure crowds gathered to watch their team play in the wartime league. He scored on his debut in a 3-1 win over Sheffield Wednesday. He scored in the 2-2 draw against Huddersfield Town. All told, George played 21 times for Barnsley during the 43-44 campaign. He had made his mark. Angus C., Barnsley's manager, could see George had all the ingredients to be a good footballer. Speed, strength, vision, awareness, courage, a fierce shot with either foot, outstanding in the air despite his 5'9" frame. He was a great passer and natural for creating space in the opposition's half of the field. In fact, the perfect inside forward. On Monday, April 30th, 1945, as Allied forces surrounded Berlin, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. On Friday, May 4th, with the last pockets of German resistance squashed, Field Marshal Montgomery accepted the unconditional surrender of German forces in the Netherlands, Denmark and northwest Germany. On Monday, May 7th, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower accepted the unconditional surrender of all German forces. On Tuesday, May 8th, George and his Barnsley teammates lost 4-2 at home to Huddersfield Town. Only 527 people were there. It was VE Day. Most like-minded souls were either in the pub or at a street party. There was jubilation. There was thanksgiving. There were bonfires topped by effigies of the Nazi dictator. It was good to be alive in and around West Melton. First official appearance. On Saturday, January 5th, 1946, George made his first official appearance as a professional football player for Barnsley at St James's Park in the 3rd round of the FA Cup against Newcastle United. Over 60,000 fans were there to see it. In common with other clubs, the Newcastle team of 1946 bore little resemblance to the 1939 version. They were a force to be reckoned with, scoring goals aplenty. They scored 9 in one match against a Stoke City side featuring Stan Matthews. At the final whistle, Matthews made a beeline for a raw 21-year-old centre forward who caught his eye, saying, "I think you have a bright future if you continue to play like that." The centre forward's name was Jackie Milburn. In the not too distant future, George Robledo and Jackie Milburn would strike up a fearsome partnership, leading to a friendship that would last them the rest of their days. Barnsley lost 4-3 to Newcastle. After the war, FA Cup ties were played home and away. So in pouring rain, with 27,000 fans packed into Oakwell, Barnsley Barnsley set about Newcastle as if their lives depended on it. When George set up Jimmy Baxter to make it 3-0, the turnaround was complete. If Jackie Milburn and Newcastle United hadn't heard of George, they knew about it now, as manager Stan Seymour said to a journalist. The man behind the win was George Robledo. It was the first time I had ever seen him, and I was greatly impressed. The Chilean Yorkshireman made his mark. The Chilean Yorkshireman would notch a further 15 goals in the wartime league during the 45-46 season. It may only have been a friendly, but the way Barnsley set about dismantling Everton towards the end of April 1946, winning 4-0 at Goodison Park, with George creating 2 and claiming 1 for himself, it didn't half bode well for the future. What George did on Saturday, August 31st, 1946, was to announce Barnsley's arrival in emphatic style. He scored twice as they bulldozed Sheffield Wednesday at Hillsborough, winning 4-2. A week later, they battered Wednesday again. George grabbed 1 and created 2 in a 4-1 victory. On Wednesday, January 22nd, 1947, the temperature dropped like a stone. Down came the snow for 55 days. Drifts 7 feet deep. Everything ground to a halt. Animals perished, people died, schools closed, rivers froze. When warmer air arrived in March, the snow melted, causing widespread flooding. The fixture backlog meant Barnsley played into June. All told, they scored 84 goals. The catch was they conceded a whopping 86. To finish a disappointing 10th in the table. Getting better. Tottenham Hotspur, Sheffield Wednesday, Newcastle United and Sheffield United wanted him. There were other suitors. What Spurs and the 2 Sheffield clubs didn't know was that Newcastle were always the favourites to land George Robledo, because his manager, Angus C, came from a village in County Durham. It really was that straightforward. Barnsley continued scoring and conceding goals in season 47-48. On their day, Barnsley shone. Take, for example, the 3-0 away win over Spurs in March 1948, when George and Jimmy Baxter, not the Rangers player, tore into the Londoners, scoring a goal apiece. By the end of his life, George was a chain smoker, his lungs black through decades of dragging on cigarettes and puffing pipes. It was a habit that would bring his time on earth to a premature end. George's goal-scoring returned in season 48-49. They were almost untouchable against second-tier opposition. He operated in plain sight, hence his nickname of the Shadow at Barnsley. World Cup 1950 on the horizon. Appointed as England's first team manager in 1946, Walter Winterbottom was humbled by leaving the power in the hands of meddling elders who infected the Football Association. Small wonder that a country with remarkable talents at his disposal, such as Matthews, Lofthouse, Shackleton, Mortensen, Milburn, Finney, Lawton, Carter, Mannion and Swift, went into decline during the 1950s, rather than lauding it on the world stage. In September 1948, somebody at the FA contacted Barnsley, asking if George would attend a get-together in Manchester. The request, typical of the FA's haywire ways, at no point did those in charge explain that this was a pre-selection gathering ahead of internationals against Northern Ireland and Wales. In the event, George was selected for an FA 11 versus an RAF 11 in Huddersfield, and he ran amok, scoring 4 goals. Only then did the FA stop to ask whether a man called Robledo was even qualified to play for England. No, came the most succinct of replies. Elizabeth Robledo said, "I don't know whether England put any pressure on him to change his citizenship, but he was determined to play for Chile." In a self-penned 1952 magazine article, George wrote, "While I was still at school, Major Frank Buckley, the Wolves manager, approached my mother and suggested I sign for Wolves. My mother insisted I should first complete my education. So instead of going to Molineux, I enrolled at Barnsley Technical College to take an engineering course." 3 Robledo brothers head for Newcastle United. On Saturday, January 22nd, 1949, George played and scored in a 4-0 win over QPR. 5 days later, Newcastle manager travelled to Barnsley with Stan Seymour, with negotiations toing and froing between a local hotel and 97 Barnsley Road, where Elsie remained throughout. Seed said, "This transfer isn't happening until this lad Walter gets £3 a week until he gets a job." Seymour agreed. For the record, Walter Robledo did get a job. The combined fee for both George and Ted was $26,500, of which $23,000 went on George. All told, he made 114 appearances for Barnsley, scoring 47 goals. As if in some kind of mourning, the wind went out of Barnsley's sails in the years ahead. The respectable 9th place finish in 48-49 made way for 13th in 49-50, 15th in 50-51, 20th in 51-52 and 22nd in 52-53, spelling relegation to 3rd Division North. Don Wearmouth said, "I'll let you into a little secret. When I heard he was leaving, I cried. He might have come from Chile, but he may as well have come from the moon. He won't have missed a player of that calibre." While cult heroes such as midfield hard man Sidney Skinner Normanton remained alongside the odd gem unearthed by Angus Seed, notably centre forward Tommy Taylor and midfielder Danny Blanchflower, who would later shine for Manchester United and Tottenham Hotspur respectively. So the likelihood of gaining promotion to the First Division gradually diminished. Newcastle beat rivals for Robledo signings. The Journal newspaper had sold out by midday on Wednesday, February 2nd, 1949. The Robledo family boarded a train at Doncaster bound for Newcastle Central. The semi-detached house, which was to be their home, was at 5 Bridgeway in Fenham. It took 30 minutes to walk to St James's Park, and that's what George did on Saturday, February 5th, to make his debut against Charlton Athletic. First Saturday in March, Newcastle went head-to-head with Sunderland. Once again, the conditions were shocking. It blew a gale and it snowed. Almost 60,000 fans passed through the turnstiles, and Sunderland went in at half-time 1-0 up. After 46 minutes, Milburn equalised when a cross was spilled by the Sunderland goalkeeper Johnny Mapson. George smashed home the ball for the winning goal. George loved writing letters, postcards and notes to people, something that only came to light after the Robledo family left Yorkshire. In the 21st century, professional footballers do not reply to fans, but George was a class act. On Friday, May 13th, Newcastle's party of 16 players and 6 staff left Southampton for New York City on board the Queen Mary. 2 weeks later, the first instalment of On Tour with George Robledo appeared on page 7 of the Barnsley Chronicle. George said, "Everything on board was magnificent. The shops were full of practically everything. Like shooting fish in a barrel." That, in essence, is what Newcastle's North American tour of 1949 amounted to, at least on the field, against second or third rate opposition. United plundered a grand total of 79 goals from 10 wins. Jackie Milburn scored 31, with George bagging 18. Nothing had been proved other than football in the USA and Canada still had a long, long way to go. No sooner had the team arrived back on Tyneside than they were straight into pre-season training. The opening games of the 49-50 league season against Portsmouth, Everton and Wolves all ended in defeat. Word had it that Jackie Milburn was unsure of his future and wanted to get away. February 1950, Sheffield Wednesday decided to make what the Daily Express called a sensational bid of $25,000 for George and Ted. The bid, which came out of the blue, stunned George, as indeed did Newcastle's decision to accept it. On Thursday, February 16th, the Journal published a story which confirmed that negotiations between the two clubs were dead in the water. Nobody was going anywhere. The upturn in results came almost immediately. From the end of February until the beginning of May 1950, United lost just one of their 14 league games, climbing from the bottom half of the table to finish in 5th place, just 3 points shy of Portsmouth, who had retained their league title. Come together. By the time the 1950 World Cup appeared on the horizon, the climate had changed. Scotland declined after finishing second in the British Home Championships. Other countries decided to give the party a miss. They included Argentina, Portugal, who refused to take Scotland's place, and Turkey, too far away. All joined the lengthy list of absentees, the likes of Russia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia and Germany. The draw finally took place on May 22nd, 1950 in Rio de Janeiro. There were 13 teams spread over 4 hopelessly unbalanced groups, 2 consisting of 4 nations, 1 of 3 and 1 of 2, which is how on Sunday, June 25th, 1950, inside the brand new Maracanã Stadium, George Robledo and Jackie Milburn came to the adversaries in what was England's first ever match at the World Cup. In May 1950, George made the journey by air from London to Santiago in 2 days. Despite stopping to refuel, pick up and set down passengers at Paris, Lisbon and Dakar, he rather liked flying. Prior to facing England, George had 3 weeks to get to know his teammates. His total lack of Spanish could have been a problem. He was christened George by his teammates and set about learning the Spanish word for some of the universal football terms. Spanish words. Pass was passer, shoot, shooter, my ball, mia, cross, centre, lead, deja, back post, al palo largo. George's teammates also taught him a few words. It was difficult, but in those first training sessions, he found they welcomed him and encouraged his use of Spanish. What they lacked in skill, they made up with in heart. There was of course the elephant in the room, namely the spectre of his father. At some point during his stay in Santiago, George became the only one of the Robledo brothers as an adult to meet their dad. Nobody knows where exactly the meeting took place. Richard Williams, grandson of their former Brampton Ellis Senior School headmaster Harold Steer, said, "I don't think Aristides was ever much more than an old wedding photograph to Ted and Walter, and within a year Aristides would be dead of natural causes, aged 57. June 24th, 1950, Brazil beat Mexico 4-0 in the first game. 24 hours later, it was Chile and England's turn to take the stage. England drew first blood through Stan Mortensen in the 38th minute. Chile hit their post twice, then George took a free kick. It was muggy, it was raining. From the moment the ball left his foot, George was certain he'd scored. Off it flew, as sweet as a well-struck golf shot. The ball deviated slightly, hit the post with Bert Williams beaten. Wilf Mannion added a second for England, who ended up victorious by 2-0. An England defender said, "Steady, George, you're not playing for Newcastle now, you know." Fish merchants picks the team. Charlie Buchan had a feeling of discomfort about the future, saying, "I thought the England team put too much emphasis on copybook football to sacrifice a punch and finish in front of goal. My doubts were not dispelled even by Mortensen's great goal and Mannion's superb shot." Walter Winterbottom pushed the case for Stanley Matthews' inclusion to face the USA, but it was in the hands of a Grimsby fish merchant by the name of Arthur Drury. So for the second game running, Matthews and Milburn would be watching a 1-0 defeat, the greatest upset in World Cup history. Chile's final game was against the USA. George could not believe how England lost. The Americans were no match for Chile, inspired by George Robledo. They won comfortably 5-2, and George said, "The Americans were forceful and robust, but we had little difficulty in beating them. How England lost, I just couldn't understand it." History has shown that England, and by association Britain, failed to learn from the mistakes of 1950. The selection of an international side by committee continued. In November 1953, Hungary, wearing V-neck collars and low-cut boots, demolished an England team wearing heavy cotton shirts and long baggy shorts 6-3 at Wembley. In a blur of visionary tactics and one-touch passing, which was repeated on the banks of the River Danube the following May, winning 7-1 in Budapest. George Robledo went out and bought 11 pairs of low-cut, lightweight, rubber-studded boots, like the ones Chile had worn in the World Cup. Could he persuade any of his Newcastle teammates to wear them? Not a chance. Nobody told me there'd be days like these. When George got home, the first thing he did was answer the piles of fan letters. The photo shows George, Walter, Elsie and Ted Robledo sifting through a typical day's fan mail. He did what we all did back in the 1950s. If somebody takes their time to write to you, it's good manners to reply. George and his family respected good manners and always replied to any fan letters. Published in a Spanish language magazine, there is a long-lost picture. The caption reads, George said, "Hasta luego, muchachos. Ya estaré on Chile con ustedes. See you later, boys. I will be back in Chile with you." Home from Chile. Isolated, set apart, distant, bloody awkward to get to. Chile is all of those things and more. Yet in the wake of the 1950 World Cup, many of South American disposition began casting envious eyes in the direction of Newcastle because of a certain football player, namely George Robledo. George, in the photograph, is far left. He lines up with his teammates at St James's Park. Jackie Milburn is second left, and Ted Robledo fifth from the left. The world was after George Robledo. In the wake of the 1950 World Cup, many South Americans began casting envious eyes in the direction of Newcastle because of George Robledo. Word had it in South America that Newcastle United were more obsessed with bank balances than winning silverware, and would in all likelihood be prepared to sell at the right price. In short, George's reputation was that of a complete footballer, a Chilean Englishman who combined the very best elements of the British and South American games: strong, skillful, creative, combative, devastating on the ground and in the air on muddy, heavy pitches. In the months that followed, several clubs from Latin America contacted Newcastle about taking George south of the equator. Colo Colo, traditionally regarded as Chile's largest and most successful club, made inquiries, as reportedly did Argentinian giants River Plate. Club Deportivo Universidad Católica of Santiago went one better by making an offer. Not just any offer, but one which amounted to an eye-watering transfer fee of £30,000. At one stage, Ambassador Bianchi returned to the Robledo's front room in Fenner on behalf of the Federation de Football de Chile to try and persuade George that his future at club level lay not on the banks of the Tyne, but beyond the Andes Mountains. Road to Wembley. As soon as George got possession, you could sense the expectation levels rising among the crowd. He was a fantastic player. Another boyhood fan of George enthused. I just thought he came from another planet, another world. That was what Bobby Robson said. For old George's brilliance, it was perhaps too much to expect Newcastle to continue to challenge for the 50-51 league title. They would finish the season in fourth place, but they had reached the FA Cup final, where they would take on Blackpool and Stanley Matthews. In those days, the only way a professional football player from these shores got to play at Wembley Stadium was by representing England or one of the other home nations or reaching the FA Cup final. Newcastle's progress to the final was beat Bury at home 4-1, Bolton 3-2, Stoke City 4-2, Bristol Rovers 0-0, replay 3-1, semi-final at Hillsborough, Wolves 0-0, replay at Leeds Road 2-1. In the game against Bolton Wanderers, the electric apparatus to limit entry through the turnstiles into the ground broke down, leading to supporters being admitted without a head count. 2 people died on that day, January 1951 day at St James's Park, with many more requiring medical attention. There was no degree of soul searching afterwards by the authorities. Many more would die at Hillsborough, as well as in January 1971, 66 Rangers fans died as they funneled out of Ibrox Park. Week before Wembley. The photograph shows the clubhouse at 5 Ridgeway, Fenner, Newcastle upon Tyne, which served as the Robledo family home from 49 to 53, and George would become the first South American to play in an FA Cup final. In the the same week that George scored 2 goals against Stoke City, his father, Aristides, died in Chile. Jackie Mooney of Blackpool said, between the semi-final and the final, there were 8 league games. We won the majority of ours, Newcastle lost 6. We were the unquestionable favourites. Blackpool didn't go away before the final, but Newcastle did. They went to Buxton in the Peak District. The plan was that Matthews would be left to the nearest man. At 9:25, the evening before the game, 17 charter trains departed Newcastle Central Station. They left at 25-minute intervals in what was dubbed Operation Magpie, bound alternatively for King's Cross and Wembley Park stations. Barry Murphy became a footballer. Barry Murphy was 11 at the time of the 51 FA Cup final and went on to be a professional footballer. He said, we didn't have much money. My father was a miner for 50 years. He came on black to the eyeballs, which put me off going underground straight away. My 2 brothers were miners. We didn't have a tailor V, so we'd go to another house at the bottom of our street in Consett, where the Kyle family lived. All the street would be sat in their lounge watching the final, to see George and the rest of the lads passing the ball around on that pitch. A real occasion, like watching the coronation. An occasion like the FA Cup final can pass you by in the blink of an eye. For George, the 51 FA Cup final wasn't like that. He remembered everything. Walking onto the field, shaking hands with King George VI, cracking Blackpool's high-risk offside trap early on, the sight of Jackie Milburn galloping in on goal to give Newcastle the lead, and Milburn made it 2-0 5 minutes later to seal the victory. George was presented with his medal by Queen Elizabeth. He shook hands with King George VI twice, not bad for a lad from the moonlight wastes of the Atacama Desert, via a Yorkshire pit village, and within a very short space of time it would get even better. Radio listeners around the nation could tune in to hear the match on the BBC Light programme, with commentary from Raymond Glendinning. However, only the second half of the match was televised by the BBC, with commentary from Jimmy Jewell, his last cup final before his death the following year, and Kenneth Wilsonall. The television footage has since been lost. Jimmy Jewell and Ben Warris? No, it can't be. Jimmy Jewell, see the photo on the right, refereed the 1938 FA Cup final before becoming manager of Norwich City 9 months later. A letter hidden in the BBC archives for more than 70 years has revealed Norwich City's pre-war manager may have also led the England team. Arthur James Jimmy Jewell, a former referee, coached the Canaries in 1939. Before becoming the BBC's main football commentator in 1947. He wrote to a producer for a Wembley all barriers pass, saying he used one when in charge of an England team. Mr. Jewell, born in West Hampstead, London in 1898, became a referee in the 1920s. He was a linesman for the 36 Berlin Olympics game under Adolf Hitler's gaze, and was referee for the Preston North End vs Huddersfield 1938 FA Cup final. He made the unusual switch to become Norwich City manager in January 1939, months before war broke out, with the former RAF pilot returning to serve for a second time. I had to find out who was Jimmy Jewell. The letter from Mr. Jewell, also known as A.J. Jewell, was uncovered at the BBC Written Archives Centre Irish and Berkshire. During the making of a radio documentary, it is thought Mr. Jewell would have managed the England team in a game during World War II. According to information pieced together, during those wartime games, they tended to just list the players selected, as opposed to peacetime minutes which recorded the officials. The challenges of wartime reduced the amount of time and details they were able or willing to put into the minutes for these games. It's one of those tantalising new discoveries which are fascinating but so hard to verify elsewhere. It deserves more. The information I have about him, he was a great character, a great football man. Mr. Jewell was the main BBC TV commentator for 5 FA Cup finals before his sudden death in 1952. A.J. Joe, seen the bottom right, training with a medicine ball with Charlie Harris at Stamford Bridge, London for the 1938 FA Cup final at Wembley. I feel fine. Newcastle enjoyed a reception at the Savoy on Saturday night and 3 days in Brighton before travelling to play Wolves on the Wednesday. They won 1-0 thanks to a 77th minute goal by George. The following morning, Newcastle's players boarded a train to Newcastle ahead of the victory procession later in the day. United's 4 victorious FA Cup wins in 1910, 1924, 1932 and 1951 were on a headboard on the front of the train. About 200,000 fans turned out to see 3 open-top coaches take the players and officials to St James's Park, where a reserve team fixture attracting a further 30,000 spectators took on the form of one big party, prior to a celebration bash being held at the Oxford Galleries Dance Hall on New Bridge Street. Team captain Joe Harvey said, "We knew we would get a terrific reception, but I never imagined it would be like this. It was wonderful." George found himself at St James's Park without his mother, being asked by Seymour to fulfil club duties. He flatly refused, asking, "Why is it the reception is room full of strangers? Why is it that, when you refuse to let my mother be present, George let him have it, both barrels? If you cross one Robledo, then you cross them all." A standout year. August 1951 saw George feeling sharper, healthier, more focused. George took his early season form and ran with it, sandwiched between his hat-trick against Spurs and the 4 goals salvo at the expense of Burnley came a brace in the 3-3 draw with West Bromwich Albion and another pair in a 2-1 win over Preston. 11 goals in 4 games. Not a bad return for someone who wasn't a centre forward. By the end of the 51-52 campaign, George had a grand total of 33 league goals to his name, more than any other player in England's top flight. Had the Golden Boot existed at the time, he would have won it. No overseas registered foreign-born player has ever reached that number. Before you ask the question, Erling Haaland was born in Leeds. George's records still stands. In the 51-52 season, something strange happened. Ted Robledo broke into United's first team. 1 appearance turned into 2, then 3, until he became a regular starter. Newcastle finished 8th in the First Division that season. For entertainment value, they came second to none, scoring 98 goals in 42 league games. Throw in the added drama of United's defence of the FA Cup, and you can see why 1952 even after all this time, remains one of the standout years in the club's entire history. George wrote in one of his magazine commissions, "The road to Wembley is a hard one." The road to Wembley. Newcastle beat Aston Villa 4-2 at home and travelled to Spurs. Few who witnessed the commanding win 3-0 thought United would not have any trouble overcoming second division strugglers Swansea Town in the 5th round, where Bobby Mitchell scored the only goal. In the quarter-finals, United faced Portsmouth at Fratton Park. In a really exciting game, Newcastle won 4-2. Milburn scored a hat-trick before George added the fourth. On to Hillsborough for the semi-final against Blackburn Rovers. Trains out of Barnsley and the Dearne Valley were full to the brim, according to the Barnsley Chronicle. Many fans in 1981, Spurs vs Wolves, 1987 Coventry vs Leeds, and 1988 Liverpool vs Notts Forest returned from Hillsborough with horror stories of overcrowding at the Leppings Lane end of the ground, leading to broken arms, legs and ribs. Then the inevitable happened in April 1989. The warnings went unheeded in the decade leading up to that fateful day, and down to the Football Association. They were useless. 4 days after failing to deliver a knockout punch, Newcastle and Blackburn went head-to-head again at Ellen Road. George scored in the second half, Rovers equalised, and Bobby Mitchell sent United to Wembley again with a penalty, following a Robledo header that was handled on the line. A day in the life. In the early 1950s, clubs in the FA Cup final were each given 12,000 tickets to sell to their supporters. The remaining 76,000 tickets were distributed to people called the football family, people employed in various capacities with the game. That's where the black market kicked in. The days, weeks and months leading up to the FA Cup final of 1952 were eventful ones, not just for football, but the UK as a whole. On the morning of February 6, King George VI had been found dead in bed at Sandringham House in Norfolk, aged just 56. The country went into mourning. In the week leading up to the cup final, it was announced that the coronation would take place at Westminster Abbey on June 2nd, 1953. The news wiped every other story off the front pages. In the immediate post-war years, if a team lost a player due to injury, then there was nothing they could do about it, other than continue one man down. This was the scenario Arsenal faced after Wally Barnes, their fullback, twisted his knee in the first half and had to leave the field. All those years ago. George Robledo saw the ball coming late. Under normal circumstances, he would draw his head back before bringing it forward sharply to meet the heavy brown leather oar, much as a cobra attacks its prey. But these weren't normal circumstances. 6 minutes remained in the 52 FA Cup final. In the league, George had scored 33 goals for Newcastle United. Another 5 had followed in the FA Cup, taking his overall tally to the thumping 38. In Game 7 of Newcastle's FA Cup run, beneath the twin towers of Wembley Stadium, with Winston Churchill on hand to present the trophy to the winners, George was feeling tired and frustrated. Bobby Mitchell, Newcastle's mesmeric winger, reckoned he knew the answer. Tall, thin and blessed with a lazy stride that fooled opponents, Bobby could see George, or Pancho as he was known, was flagging. But during the half-time talk, George said, "I'll always be on the far post." The Mitchell cross came at speed towards George. He instinctively let him glance off his brow towards the near post. Everybody in the stadium seemed to freeze. It was as if Wembley Stadium was a record player. A giant hand reached down and lifted the needle, cutting the sound as well as the action in an instant. Would Swindon make a save? Would the ball hit a post? Or would George faint right there through sheer exhaustion? What happened? When the giant hand eventually returned the needle to the record player, it came accompanied by a roar from the Newcastle supporters among the 100,000 strong crowd. The ball had struck the inside of Swindon's left-hand post on its way to the back of the net. This image inspired John Lennon to reach for his paintbrushes. George scores the winning goal for Newcastle United in the 52 FA Cup final. It was called Walls and Bridges, signed John Lennon, June 1952, aged 11. Rideau considered himself to be a calm, rational soul. War tends to shape you that way, as does post-war frugality and 13 months working down a coal mine. He had an FA Cups winner's medal, as did his brother Ted, who passed the ball to Bobby Mitchell stationed on United's left flank. The match. Reduced to 10 men for 3/4 of the game, Arsenal went into defensive mode as Newcastle started to get their act together. For almost the entire second half, Newcastle hammered away at Arsenal. With 15 minutes to go, it was around this point that Pancho had his eureka moment. In the 84th minute, Ted Rideau gained possession on the left. He swept the ball out to Mitchell, standing parallel with the Arsenal penalty area, unmarked. The cross, when it came, George was on the far post, he recalled later. When I saw a defender moving towards the middle of the goal, I headed for the far post. The ball came over the heads of several players. I headed it hard and nearly passed out as the ball hit the post and went into the net. Newcastle hadn't played well. The papers reported, Sunday Times said, Arsenal might have easily won this match even with 10 men. The Times said Saturday in truth belonged to the vanquished. Newcastle won the cup, Arsenal won the glory. The News of the World said Arsenal were the dominant force, but for Barnes' injury, I feel confident they would have won. The cup was presented by Winston Churchill, who said well done to George as he gave him his medal. Thank you, said George in reply. Last balls for United. In short, the players were knackered. Instead, a side boasting such talents as George Rideau, Bobby Mitchell and Jackie Milburn were left staring up at the rest of the table from around the relegation zone. The Newcastle United's board of directors seemed intent on having their cake and eating it. For all Newcastle's on-field programmes, George still thoroughly enjoyed living in the area. He fished, he played table tennis in the Northumberland County League, a member of Fenham Tennis Club. He coached youth club football teams and ran gym classes 3 evenings a week on behalf of the local education authority, working free of charge. Colo of Santiago was still closely monitoring George's progress from the other side of the world, not to mention United's tussle with relegation. George missed almost as many games as he played over the course of the 52-53 season due to niggling injuries. Newcastle, without a win in 11 games stretching back to Christmas Day, travelled to face Derby County on March 21st. Derby battered them, but in the final 10 minutes, George converted twice to seal a crucial 2-0 win. As it turned out, they would be the last goals he ever scored for Newcastle. On February 27, Manuel Bianchi paid a visit to the Robledo house in Fenton. He was there as a friend of the family, if anyone asked. One for all for one. In fact, Chile's ambassador to Britain travelled north by train from London on a mission. Between them, Colo Colo and the Chilean Football League had formulated a package which they believed George and his family would be unable to resist. Over tea and cake, Bianchi went through what was on offer. Colo Colo wanted to sign both George and Ted. They would be paid £30 each a week. The maximum wage for a player in England stood at £14. In addition, there would be the equivalent of a £20 win bonus and £10 for a draw on signing. George would receive £4,000 and Ted £3,000 in hard cash. They would have private tutors to learn the language, personal bodyguards and a spacious, fully furnished clubhouse in which to live with Elsie and Walter if they wanted to go to Santiago. George and Ted would be football consultants to the Chilean government, whatever exactly that meant. Nonetheless, with the Robledos, it remained a case of all for one for all. 21 years after sailing from Iquique on the Reina del Pacifico, the Robledos were going back to Chile. On Saturday, March 28th, George walked onto St James's Park for the last time. Not that his teammates and the crowd knew it. The opposition was Blackpool. Newcastle United lost 1-0. The following week, negotiations began. A fee of £15,000 was mentioned and duly accepted. Words lovingly crafted. Nick Harris would write in his book, England, their professionalism was unquestioned. On and off the pitch, they trained well and looked after themselves as full-time athletes, not twice-weekly entertainers who could spend 5 nights a week in the pub. They sought new experiences and ultimately better money, befitting their talents, and George, while adopting to whatever system of play was asked to be part of, also liked innovation. Above all, through their looks, style and flair, they compelled people to pay good money through the turnstiles to watch them. 2 hours later, having seen something just a little bit different, a little bit magical, they went home happy. Beautiful words, lovingly crafted. Like at Olympic, there are certain football clubs which, for all manner of reasons, tend to be associated with their respective countries more than others. Asked to name a French football team, you would probably say Paris Saint-Germain rather than Nantes. Name a German football club, Bayern Munich or Juventus when it comes to Italy, and so on. There was a time when 2 of the most recognisable words in the English language were Bobby and Charlton. Such was Manchester United's appeal around the globe. Fans of the likes of Marseille, Borussia Dortmund, Inter Milan and Liverpool may quibble, but that's just the way history has declared it. So it goes with Colo Colo when it comes to Chile. Colo Colo formed in 1925. In 1927, Colo Colo founder and captain David Arellano died after accidentally colliding with an opponent in a friendly match in Spain, where they were on tour. 5 years later, 3 people were killed and over 130 injured when a stand collapsed during the match. Through it all, the name Colo Colo garnered a certain cachet and romance, in the same way Manchester United did in the wake of the 1958 Munich air disaster, both in terms of the way the club handled itself in times of adversity and the calibre of players it attracted. remains George Robledo. The benchmark for all airport welcomes, the Beatles arriving at John F. Kennedy Airport were still 11 years away. George and Ted were left to fend for themselves. Only a handful of security guards were present to control the thousands of fans who converged on Los Cerritos Airport to witness their arrival. Santiago had never seen anything quite like it. The Robledos certainly had never seen anything like it, not even after Newcastle United's victorious FA Cup home games of 1951 and 1952. This time, everyone had turned up just for them and gave them a red carpet of love and affection. Love. George and Ted became the most famous players in Chile. It was enough for them just to arrive and be in Chile. Everyone, no matter which team they supported, wanted to see the so-called gringos in Chile. Anglo-Saxons are called gringos. People used to wait for them in hotels, outside training, everywhere. You had this pair of gringos who dressed elegantly, living their very English life in Santiago de Chile. For George, the brief respite from playing football allowed him time to do one of the things he loved most in life, write to people. Over the weeks that followed, untold letters, telegrams and postcards started dropping through letterboxes at homes across Yorkshire and North East England, courtesy of George Robledo, as George usually signed his name. In an attempt to keep pace with what became known as Robledo Mania in Chile, Colo Colo also had thousands of postcards produced featuring a picture of George in his first team kit. Anyone contacting the club for an autograph would receive a postcard signed by George with the inscription, "With best of wishes, George Robledo," accompanied by the date. On May 31st, 1953, a fortnight after arriving in Chile, George made his Colo Colo debut in front of 40,000 fans at the Estadio Nacional in Santiago, scoring twice in the 4-0 thrashing of mid-table Ferro Badminton. 6 weeks later, he won a 4th international cap as Chile lost 2-1 to Spain. A new connection. George snatched a late winner for Chile as Peru were beaten 2-1 in Lima in the first ever Copa del Pacifico match between the two countries. On November 15th, he scored 5 in the 8-3 demolition of Magallanes, a result that saw Colo Colo crowned champions of the Primera Division for the 6th time in the club's history. George scored 26 goals in the 53 season, which ran from May to December. While tucking into his lunch at the city's plush Hotel Alcazar, George was approached by an attractive dark-haired woman, Gladys Nissen, who had just wanted to welcome George to her homeland. The exchange was brief, but some kind of connection seemed to have been made. Months later, with Colo Colo having been crowned as the new Primera Division champions, Gladys invited the club's directors, along with the Robledo brothers, to her residence for dinner. It should be said that Gladys worked at the American Embassy in Santiago. Organising functions was her forte. The dinner was held on December 8th. It was a roaring success. At the end of the evening, George and Gladys were left still dancing. They were never apart again, said Elizabeth, their daughter. We might have discovered the perfect footballer. Gladys and George were married in September 1959. Colo Colo won another Premier Division in 1956 having finished second in 54, 55 and 58. The photograph shows a family man at home in Rancagua with wife Gladys and daughter Elizabeth. George's reputation for being a gentleman on and off the field, as Chileans described him, reserved, respectful and modest, as well as friendly. He wasn't hot-headed, didn't cheat, he wasn't dirty, didn't argue with referees. He just played the game his way, to great effect. Chilean mothers and fathers were naming their newborns George. A popular city centre bar changed its name to Rublidos. Unsolicited deliveries to his home of fish, bread, cakes, cigarettes, wine and English tea became a daily occurrence in my life. Colo had initially tried to curb his nicotine habit to smoke no more than 5 cigarettes a day. It was a rule he struggled with and ultimately failed to stick to. Somehow, despite a habit of about 30 cigarettes a day, George remained a force to be reckoned with. In 1955, Chile finished runners-up in the South American Championship, staged in Santiago. George scored 3 goals and created several more throughout the tournament, beating Ecuador 7-1, Peru 5-4 and Paraguay 5-0. They drew 2-2 with Uruguay before losing narrowly 1-0 to competition winners Argentina. Later that year, George took the field in Rio de Janeiro and Chile did the unthinkable by drawing 1-1 in a friendly with glorious, flamboyant, all-singing, all-dancing Brazil. Club President Antonio Laban met with George and Ted in the Santiago restaurant for dinner and an informal chat. Of course, he wanted them to stay, but did they want to stay? Chile had failed to qualify for the World Cup in Switzerland. Tottenham Hotspur, Arsenal, Cardiff City, Newcastle United inevitably threw their hats into the ring, as well as Barnsley. Never one to be rushed, unless on a football field. George thought long and hard through the Christmas period into the new year. The answer, when it finally came, wasn't what the interested clubs wanted to hear. The brothers would be staying in Chile with Colo. The bitter bit never left England. If moving back to Britain risked jeopardising his relationship with Gladys in any way, he wasn't prepared to do it. And with that, so the drawbridge went up between the Rublidos and the UK. It wasn't that inquiries ceased, more than they never got past first base. His daughter Elizabeth said, Dad had a big collection of vinyl records, which he would listen to. For instance, he would get up early to watch Truth with the Colour. He would watch the FA Cup final. He could get very emotional. I could see him crying. Britain never went away. It was always in his heart. He laughed at the Benny Hill show. He was happy in Chile, but a bit of him never really left England. As much as George was in love with Gladys, as much as he occasionally yearned for Britain, by 1956 he developed a deep affection for Chile and Santiago. In particular, over time strangers became acquaintances, some went on to become good friends. He was astonished to find that his and Ted's transfer from Newcastle United had been part funded by an increase in the club membership fees, paid every month by Colo supporters. Rather than being angry, George felt flattered, bordering on humbled. If he had ever needed confirmation about the virtues of moving to Chile and staying there, that was it. Borrowed time. In 1957, George scored just twice in 17 games, and he made his 31st and final appearance for Chile, losing 2-0 to Argentina in a World Cup qualifier. His age and that smoking habit finally caught up with him. The following season he scored 10 goals, but all this failed to dent his status as a Colo-Colo legend. After 154 appearances and 96 goals, a parting of the ways became inevitable. Ted by this time had returned to England in 1957 to play for Notts County after a failed marriage to a flamenco dancer. The Rublinos were no longer all for one and one for all. Soon Walter would return to London in his new role as head of exports for Thomas Bolton, a copper company, followed eventually by Elsie, who retreated to the Suffolk town of Lowestoft. As for George, 50 miles south of Santiago lies the city of Rancagua, home to the O'Higgins Football Club and the Braden Copper Company. It was here that George and Gladys came in 1959 to new jobs. Gladys as an executive secretary to the boss and George as manager of industrial relations. Elizabeth said much later, Dad was in charge of all the sports and social events within the company. On September 12, 1959, George and Gladys were married, and after finally hanging up his boots for good, George took charge of the 3 junior teams at O'Higgins Football Club. For 20 years, he saw hundreds of young hopefuls from Rancagua achieve their dreams. 1962 World Cup. On Sunday, May 22nd, 1960, an earthquake registering 9.5 on the Richter scale struck 100 miles off the coast of Chile. Thousands of people were killed or injured. 2 million left homeless. Countries as far away as New Zealand, Japan, and the Philippines were severely affected. Estimates put the damage in Chile alone at $550 million. $5 billion in today's money. In May 1962, England travelled to Rancagua, where they set up camp at the Braden Copper Company at Coyu, with George Rublino acting as their liaison officer, attaché, interpreter, and all-round fixer. See the photograph of George and Walter Winterbutt. Chile qualified for the 1966 World Cup. The Football Federation of Chile asked George if he would travel to England to be responsible for everything from logistics to translating. He turned them down because he didn't want to be away from his family for several months. The circumstances surrounding Ted Rublino's last 24 hours on Earth are shrouded in heartache, mystery, lies and deception. He disappeared in Dubai. There was a trial of the German skipper called Heinz Bezemek, who was alleged to have thrown Ted overboard. His body was never found, and there was the underlying sense that justice had been denied. George dies at 62. George's first heart attack came at home on Saturday, April 1st, 1989. He just survived that long and was rushed to hospital. Later the same day, he suffered a second cardiac arrest, which proved fatal. He was 62 years old. In Chile, his death was greeted with an immense outpouring of grief. Television news bulletins, every newspaper carried the story for days. Back in England, the Evening Chronicle's sports writer John Gibson wrote, George Rublino, Newcastle United's great goal-scoring star of the 1950s, has died suddenly at his home in Chile. He played the 1951 and 1952 FA Cup final triumphs at Wembley. He was 62 and is the third member of United's glory sides to die, recently following his fine striking partner Jackie Milburn and Joe Harvey. I received a phone call today from younger brother Walter, who lives in London, to say George had died. The funeral is tomorrow. He wasn't drinking, but was smoking a lot, and was dreadfully missing his daughter, who had gone to live in Australia. George paid a nostalgic trip back to Tyneside in 1981. His brother Ted died in 1970 in mysterious circumstances when he went missing from a tanker in the Persian Gulf. The captain was later charged with his murder, but later acquitted. Ted's body was never found. And the final slide.